In 1787, a small fleet left Portsmouth. On board were men, women and children who had been emptied out of British prisons. The establishment reckoned that if the criminal population were out of sight, they'd also be out of mind. So they shipped them off to an unexplored continent on the other side of the world. This is a short history of convict Australia. The late 18th century was a time of massive social and political upheaval. The French had had their revolution, and America had just won its independence. The Industrial Revolution, as well as harsh property laws, had created a new underclass in Britain. In the cities, overcrowding and unemployment led to a massive crime wave. The gallows were oversubscribed and the prisons were overcrowded, but the authorities had the answer: transportation to the land that Captain Cook had stumbled across 20 years earlier. Prior to transportation, convicts were kept in rotting warships, floating prisons anchored on the River Thames and Portsmouth Harbour. As they transferred from the prison hulks to the waiting ships, most convicts were looking at sentences to transportation of 7 years, 14 years, or life. Over the next 80 years, 160,000 convicts would be transported to Australia. The men outnumbered women by 6 to 1, and their average age was only 26. Before the convicts were sent to Australia, they'd be in the harbour for a couple of months on prison ships, and that is probably their last view of England, their loved ones, or the families. Because they had so much time on their hands, they'd whittle away at these things, which are just ordinary pennies, and what they'd do, individually inscribe something as a memento which they give to their loved ones or their family. It'll be a special message, almost like the last thing, a last memorial of their life in England. So this one here's, they're quite sad. You've got, Dear Sarah, when this you see, remember me when I'm in some foreign country. And this is my favourite, this is really, oh. I love thee till death shall take my breath. They're really quite sad. They're almost like tombstones of their life in England. Between 1787 and 1867, transport fleets set sail from British ports with their human cargo. The voyage, 15,000 miles, took up to 8 months. The first fleet arrived in January 1788, and the Union Jack was raised over Sydney Cove. After their grueling passage, the convicts, as well as their military guards, began a new settlement on the rocky summits around what is now Sydney Harbour. Trees were cleared and rudimentary shacks were built.
This was all built on rock. This all had to be carved away. There were great, huge overhanging caverns, which had probably been used by people before. The Cadigal tribe of the Eora were probably here, watching out over the ships as they came in. It's often stated that this was a jail, but it began as a free colony and became more jail-like later. This was like they built their own town. This was the convicts' town, because they were 90% of the population and they did more or less what they pleased. The men were often stonemasons and butchers and bakers and all the sorts of people you need to found a colony.
Yeah.
And women were seamstresses, they could mend clothes, they knew of course about child rearing, which is very important because there were lots of children here.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, if you'd wanted to plan a colony of immigrants, you really couldn't have done better. And I'm sure that's why the colony survived, because it was full of these youngish, energetic, literate, go-getting people who took opportunities as they found them.
In January each year, the arrival of the first fleet of convicts is commemorated on what is now known as Australia Day.
We started off as convicts and all endured great hardship in coming out to the colony. And it resulted in a much stronger character being formed than those that initially came out, because they had to adapt to the harsh conditions.
We've found ways of living in a liberty and a freedom that has come from people who've been oppressed in different ways to finding a way of believing in justice of human beings.
That will be marching out to Oxford to again re-establish.
The Australia Day holiday to Aboriginal people, it's not a holiday, it's a day of mourning for us, because it represents that time 200 years ago when they actually came and said that this was, vacant land, nobody lived on it, and therefore terra nullius. So it's a very important day for us, a day of mourning, a day of protest, a day of solidarity for Aboriginal people to just reaffirm the fight.
And it's going to go on and on and on.
When Aboriginal people saw how convicts were being treated, they felt very sorry for the convicts, and there was actually an interaction between convicts and Aboriginal people that was more underground, that the soldiers and the rest of the community sort of weren't aware of until very much later. Convicts that were actually escaping and going and living with Aboriginal groups, that was the only way that they survived, was finding some Aboriginal people to look after them. In the 200 years, white Australians have learnt so very little about Aboriginal people and the importance of land to us and the importance of relationships to us. They have demonstrated their moral bankruptcy in so many different ways in the 200 years. Those people of the convict era are still part of those family structures, and they would have taught their children, and that their children would have taught their children, so there would have been a handing down of particular mores within that family.
There's now an increasing interest in the convict era, but it hasn't always been that way. For nearly 200 years, it's been covered up by white Australia.
I'm Juanita Minter. My ancestor was Hugh Hosey, and he was a convict, and he was a housebreaker. My mother, she was horrified, and she had already told us that Hugh Hosey, who was her great-grandfather, had been born in Glasgow and educated in Edinburgh. Well, he must have been a slow learner or a kleptomaniac, because he didn't do very well. And when I told her he was a convict, she couldn't believe it. She was genuinely distressed. And after writing a book about it, I said, "Oh dear, if I've sold all the books out, I might have to print some more." And she said, "Well, leave all the bits about convicts out," which wouldn't have left any book.
As interest in the convict era grows, revisionist historians at sites like Hyde Park Barracks are processing mountains of paperwork left behind by the British authorities. Okay, Beverly, what's this mad machine here?
Well, this is a computerised database containing the names of all the convicts that passed through Hyde Park Barracks.
So how does it work then? I tap in my second name, yeah?
Yes.
A-T-T-D, boom, and return. And then everyone under that name will come up, yeah?
Yes, all your ancestors, all your uncles and cousins from...
Pressure.
There you are.
Gee.
Charles, Edward.
God, there's hundreds of them, isn't there?
Yeah.
Look at that. It shows you what ship they came on and everything.
Oh,
yeah?
yes, they were all identified by their ship because we've got so many with the same name. We've got over 100 John Smiths in here.
All right.
So unless you say what ship they came on, you'll never find them.
I'd come under here as John Smith. It's like, you've got to have a dodgy name on you. What other Wrights do you know then? Let's...
Well, there's George Wright.
Search, find. Boop. George Wright, what did he get up to?
Well, there he is. He's
Yeah.
a Yorkshire man. He was a coal miner.
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
he was put to work here as a well sinker. He was out here in the barracks yard sinking a well using explosives.
Yeah.
And as you can see, he blew himself to pieces.
Brilliant.
My name is Sue Capel, that's my married name, and my mother, Naoma, is the grandchild of a convict that came to Australia in 1832. And she never realised the connection until I started delving into the history. You can feel akin to these people because they're a bloodline, and you get... and if you are lucky enough to have convicts, and I say lucky because I think they were special people. They did come through a lot, and you get physical descriptions of them. You can find out their character through their letters. The well-behaved ones didn't have as much written about them, but the ones that had a bit of old nick in them, you find that you find a lot of paperwork still surviving in their own handwriting sometimes.
Records of the early days, before the jail was built, list punishments that were rudimentary but severe. Secondary offenders were often chained up and marooned on islands in Sydney Harbour, like Pinchgut Island, so named because of the diet of bread and water. But as the system grew, punishments were more structured.
There was the treadmill, where prisoners who were in private assignment might be punished for doing things like being insolent to their mistress. Next in severity came flogging, which was quite acceptable in the British justice system, because it was even allowable in the Army and Navy in those days. Nobody could be flogged unless they were sentenced to flogging by a magistrate. And of course, in order to hold a flogging, you had to have a triangle. You had to have a scourger, which was paid by the government.
Scourger, do your duty.
There had to be a surgeon present at the flogging.
1,
There had to be a drummer to count the beats.
2, 3.
And oftentimes all the other prisoners were lined up to witness this as an example and teach them not to do the same offence. We have vivid descriptions of floggings, of how the blood ran at the 11th lash and the prisoner cried out and continued crying and the prisoner collapsed, and they were very cruel punishments.
There are still a few surviving Australians who have first-hand experience of the extreme punishment suffered by their grandparents' generation.
I'm Murray Kent. Trevor Ron's my friend. My grandfather was sent out here for taking 4 shillings and a tobacco pouch. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for it. The cat o' nine tails, whales and that on him was like a corrugated road. And in the summer months, they used to have to rub cod liver oil into it to keep them... it was like if they was really burnt, and it used to keep it soft so they didn't crack open or anything. And there was another old chap lived on the lawn just outside, old Bob Abraham. He was the same, and he used to say, "Look what the redcoats done to me," but he used to use bad language. My elder sister can remember that.
Along with the punishment records, historians are taking a fresh look at the detailed physical records of the convicts, from the shape of their noses to the tattoos on their skin.
What we did was we looked at the descriptions that were taken of convicts when they arrived in Australia. So the authorities wrote down a description of what they looked like in case the convict was wicked enough to try and abscond. And then the written description was posted in the newspapers and circulated to the police. So there's this double-edged kind of thing that in one sense it makes it easier for the authorities to track them. And on the other hand, it gives them some kind of personal identification mark, which avoids them being relegated to the role of just a number. There's much in the tattoos which, to be quite frank, we don't understand. And that makes them really interesting. That no matter how trivial the reason, there is a reason behind every tattoo that appears on a convict. This fits into that kind of idea about the tattoos being like love tokens that you can't take off them, or that give the convict their own identity back. Because what this guy is saying is Angus Mackay, government property.
Yeah. Strike me fair, stand firm and do your duty.
Absolute beauty. Stripped his shirt off and turned around and the flogger saw that. Because convicts were flogged in public with other convicts looking on, what was the effect of flogging a convict that had a crucifixion scene on their chest, with Christ bleeding and an angel with a cup catching the blood? It's the authorities that are sinful. It's the authorities that are like Pontius Pilate. Christ was tried by the judicial courts of his day and sentenced to horrendous punishments, including floggings.
In 1810, there was a new sheriff in town. He was a Scottish military leader that had experience in the colonies. His name was Lachlan Macquarie, and not only did he want to make his stamp on the governorship, he also wanted this colony to be the pride of the British Empire. The New South Wales appointment was going to be his last chance, so that meant one thing: order. Until Macquarie's arrival, the convicts wore civilian clothes, but the new regime wanted to set them apart from the increasing numbers of free settlers.
If you have a look at it, it's very clearly punishment dress, because it's marking you out as being out of the crowd. You would have difficulty slotting into a crowd in that sort of clothing, because you've got prisoner barracks, PB marked on your thighs, and if you look down either seam of your trousers, they button.
Yeah, I noticed that. I tried to go to the toilet later and there's no flies. You have to sort of do the side bit. Why is that?
Well, that was done so that the trousers could be unbuttoned down both sides and removed over a set of leg irons. So you can always tell the punishment trousers had to be unbuttoned so that they could be taken off without removing leg irons. If you committed a second crime once you were in Australia, if you tried to escape, if you abused an overseer or a military guard, then you would be put on trial a second time, and you would be convicted. If found guilty, you'd be convicted of a secondary offence. And frequently, punishment for a secondary offence meant imprisonment in irons or labour in irons. Really? And what that meant was these were enclosed around your ankles and then riveted on. Not screwed on, not locked on, but riveted. So they couldn't be undone.
Yeah.
You wore these for the period of your punishment, which could be up to 7 years. Usually it was just a matter of months.
Using the skills of a convicted architect, Francis Greenway, as well as the never-ending supply of convict labour, Governor Macquarie embarked on an ambitious building programme. Macquarie wanted to leave his mark on the new colony. His buildings remain landmarks in modern Sydney. The Hero of Waterloo is one of the oldest convict-built pubs still in use. Money was not the common currency for years. Instead, a complex system of barter for labour and services gradually evolved. As the colony was attracting trade, the main currency was alcohol, which went under the generic title of rum.
A little bit of brandy, ginger beer. Store fence it's called.
Store fence?
Have a sip
Is
of
that one of the traditional drinks, yeah?
Beautiful. That'll give you a kick.
Oh, I'll give you more than a kick. Oh, what other drinks were there?
There's another one here I got for you.
I'm
The
finished.
Catherine Hayes.
The Catherine Haynes.
Pretty.
Have I got to drink that as
Pretty
well?
well known one, this one.
As the colony grew, settlement expanded into Sydney's outlying regions. As a harsher form of punishment, convict chain gangs were used on large road building projects, and the most ambitious was the North Road. 100 miles out of the city, a section still exists at Wiseman's Ferry. Convicts in leg irons worked in chain gangs, breaking the rocks to build the roads. Is this like a trek, like walking place that anyone can come on?
Oh yes, yes. The National Parks and Wildlife Service have been restoring it and opening it for people to walk on. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's quite a nice little walk. The conditions out here must have been quite harsh for the convicts, wasn't it, in this heat?
Yeah.
How do you survive that?
Particularly in summer, you got hot, you got sunburnt, you got bitten by ants and spiders and prickled by bushes. It wasn't very comfortable.
Even worse than the back-breaking work were the sleeping quarters. Flimsy wooden caravans which were hauled along by the convicts, who had no other means of shelter. After 12 hours hard labour on the road, chained up, this is what people had to look forward to in the evening. 20 sweaty bodies crammed in here, still in chains, no toilet. Come Ralph, you've been dying to show me what's in your sack. Let's have a look.
Okay.
And this is the sort of thing that the convicts would use here?
They would have used tools like this, but I'll show you one in a second.
So it's not just for the stonemasons and stuff, it would be for the convicts?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But surely, wouldn't they nick them and then try and escape? I mean, you could get your irons off with that sort of thing, couldn't you?
Government tools had broad arrows put on them to show that they were government property.
Right. So this is an old one,
This is an old convict stone-breaking hammer, yeah.
Right. And that's the arrow?
That's the arrow there, yeah. And there's one on each side, yeah.
Right. Oh, yeah. And it would be on all the tools?
All the tools, all the bedding, all the clothing, all the furniture, all had an arrow on it like that somewhere.
Right. Why would they have the arrow on?
It came from the Sydney family. That was part of their coat of arms, and they allowed the British government to use that as the King's mark. Right. It's a much more simple device than having a crown on it.
I'm going to nick this.
Bastard.
Life in the iron gangs was too much for some convicts. Many absconded and took their chances in the bush. Great legends have arisen around the escapades of the bushrangers, the Australian equivalent of the outlaw. The most famous, Jack Donahue, used to shelter in the caves just outside the town now known as Picton. Shot dead, aged 21, he was immortalised in the ballad of Jack Donahue, which at the time was banned as a treason song.
If you will but listen, a sorrowful tale I'll tell, concerning a young hero in action lately fell. His name it was Jack Donahue, of courage and renown, who scorned to live in slavery or be humble to the crown. On the 24th of August it was his fatal day, as he and his companions were cruising the highway. He was hailed by the horse police, he stood with heart and hand. Come on, my lads, cried Donahue, we'll fight the man for man. the awful end of Donahue, the truth to you I've told, and hope that all good Christians will pray for his soul. May the holy angels guard him, likewise our heavenly King, and our Saviour dear who died for us, redeem his soul from sin.
In the 1800s, huge estates like the one at Lanyon just outside Canberra were run by settlers who could get free convict labour in exchange for feeding and clothing them. By the 1820s, the labour of the vast majority of convicts was used in this way. If a convict behaved well during assignment, he was given a probationary passport known as a ticket of leave.
It's a very small document that was required to be carried on the convict at all times. To have a ticket of leave didn't mean that you were absolutely free in any sense. You still had to show up for regular musters, and there were very close conditions over what you could and couldn't do. You could not have a convict assigned to you, for example. You couldn't own a pub. You couldn't move outside the district in which the ticket was granted to you. This is part of the very close bureaucratic control over convicts in New South Wales. People know where they are and what they've done. But most importantly, I think it says that this person is entitled to employ himself, in parentheses, and this is very important, off the stores. That means they had no entitlement to draw upon government stores in any lawful occupation within the district of Maitland, in this case, for his own advantage during good behaviour. And again, the ticket of leave could be taken from a convict if they didn't observe the conditions or if they were shown to be no longer worthy of it. All it's attempting to do is make more use of a convict's skills in a growing colony where there's a gross shortage of labour.
Good behaviour could actually lead to a conditional pardon, or for a handful of convicts, a free pardon. Continued bad behaviour led to a fate worse than death. 1,500 miles off the coast of New South Wales was an island which was home to the most brutal prison of the convict period. Its name was Norfolk Island. The British wanted an institution that would act as a deterrent in the colony, and they also wanted a system that would terrify those in Britain who heard its name.
One young Irish man in the early 1830s here described 20 lashes on this island to be the equivalent of 100 elsewhere. And just prior to getting to Norfolk, he'd received 300. On his time on Norfolk, he used to receive almost 4,000. We see on Norfolk Island these sorts of little...
I was going to say, why is it so bad, the whipping?
Well, the lead is in place in it merely to tear flesh off the back.
Oh, and you couldn't spay much more than 20 or something with that.
Young Frayne received 100 of these before the flagellator refused to go on. They have to remove him to this hospital, where his back scabs over, and then they give him another 100 more on his own request to get it over and done with, because he'd been issued 300. Yes. At the end of the 100 on the back, he downs his trousers and takes the other 100 on his buttocks and thighs, and then he's thrown back into a cell. The only treatment for a flogging here is when we urinate on the ground and we lie in it. I find incredible physical brutality here.
Is that because it was sort of so far away from anywhere else they couldn't keep an eye on it?
Well, Norfolk, much like today, is out of sight, out of mind. Bishop Robert Wilson of Tasmania comes to Norfolk Island as a snap inspection, and the descriptions he gives of the men behind us in the new jail are much the same as we hear out of Germany at the end of the Second World War. Men looking like living skeletons, and the skin is the yellowish colour. They've been chained and manacled to iron grates. We also, at this period of our history, we start to notice a common theme of communal suicide. A lot of evidence isn't around, but we get the hinges of it, and even Major Anderson, the commandant, at one stage acknowledges it. You get in a big group of men, and we draw two straws, the two short straws, of course. One becomes the killer, one becomes the person to be killed. One rips a bit of iron bar into one's stomach, and the other one, quite simply, gets taken out of Norfolk Island to Australia, as we had no magistrate here at that time, and he is hung in Sydney.
So they'd rather draw straws than one get murdered?
Well, I think it always asks the question in all these penal establishments around the world. Men have survived enormous hardships, but here on Norfolk Island we're finding suicide is preferable.
After the reports of the brutality and the horror on Norfolk Island leaked back to Britain, the settlement was gradually closed down. Offenders were then sent to the southern end of Tasmania, to the very tip of the Tasman Peninsula. As the convict ships rounded the huge basalt cliffs at Cape Pillar, they entered the pride of the colonial prison system. Easy to police and hidden away from civilization, this was Port Arthur. Prison reformers back in Britain wanted to experiment with new forms of punishment. The centrepiece of the new institution was the model prison.
The model prison was sort of a trial prison based on one in London called Pentonville, which was another name for it, and it was designed by the Royal Engineers in conjunction with prison reformers. And the idea was to stop people getting flogged and knocked about in corporal punishment, chains and all the rest of it. You could sort of put people into silent rooms and break them down into good corporate citizens and make them well behaved. It was really sort of sensory deprivation. The guards were made to wear slippers on their feet, and they had carpet running down the hallway so that to deaden all sorts of sound. And when the blokes came out of their cells, they put masks on their faces so they couldn't recognise each other. And the guards couldn't even, in theory, recognise them. And when they wanted to move them into the chapel or out to the exercises yards, and they clapped hand signals. So there was very little verbal communication.
And was that the only time that they get to use their voice?
Yeah, in the chapel, yeah, that was the only time they could sing like buggery for twice a week and communicate with each other at the same time.
Did they have a code then while they sang?
Well, possibly. I remember reading in Britain they used to also tap on the wall so they could communicate that way possibly as well. So there's a...
But here it would be hard to check.
Well, the walls are the same thickness, that's possibly because there was also a ducting system, and you could use that apparently to sort of tap on, and also the bars at the cells.
Right.
You could use that. The whole thing was to depersonalise and break the spirit of the person down. The other significance of this place was to break down any sort of gang action. There was also an underlying sense of threat from the working class. The French Revolution was in the background to all of this as well. So there's that fear of what became the trade union movement, really, of men working together for a common cause.
I'm Alan Briggs, a farmer. My family's lived here for 5 generations. We claim to be descended from a convict overseer at Port Arthur. One old fella came up to me and he said, "Alan," he said, "aren't these buildings beautiful? Isn't that lovely stonework and lovely brickwork?" And I stood back and I looked at him and thought, "What are you on about?" And I stood back and looked at it, and he pointed out to me, and you know, that was the first time in my life I'd ever given it this look, and ever since then I could see the beauty, but I didn't see the beauty because it was familiar.
Now 42 trades were practised here. You can well imagine what some of those trades would have been. It would have been carpenters, wheelwrights, tinsmiths, blacksmiths, you name it, they did it. They made all their own shoes, they made all their own clothing. Now, of course,
Even before Port Arthur closed down, tourists used to come here to have a gorp at the jail. When it did finally close, cottage industry sprang up, making fake whips and leg irons. Now that the climate's changed and people can't get enough of their convict past, they also can't get enough of the convict souvenirs. Woo! Get your irons, leg irons and handcuffs, all original, all made here, dating back to early 18s. Anyone want game cards before you get flogged? Yeah? Okay. You, madam, yeah? You'll need it. Know what I mean? Dirty girl. They are nice lead figures of mass torture. Being separated from the mainland by an easily defended isthmus, the Tasman Peninsula was a prison within a prison. Convicts built and powered a railway which connected watchtowers and workstations on the peninsula. Although the tracks are long gone, the cuttings still lead to the timber station at Cunha. Here, many of the buildings which housed the convicts remain intact, including the mess hall where 200 men were fed daily. This is what a convict would have for their daily ration. Breakfast would be Frosties, 1 roll, and this, a bowl full of oatmeal. Water would go in that, and if they was really lucky, scrapings of meat. Boil that up and it would be like a nasty porridge. There we are. For lunch, nice big roll, just goes there, and a pound of meat, like that. But in them days, it wouldn't look like this. It would be this, dried out and salted. Then for the evening meal, they'd just 1 roll, I'm afraid. And if they was good, cup of tea. And if you was an overseer, you'd have a spoonful of sugar in that. Well, for me, it's time to make some breakfast. Well, this is the breakfast. Oatmeal, water, and bits of beef. They called it skilly. Like elsewhere, escape attempts in Tasmania were frequent. Some of the most amazing stories hail from across the rainforests and mountains of Tasmania, from an isolated settlement which which was meant to be escape-proof. Built in the middle of Macquarie Harbour, it was a natural prison known as Sarah Island. The convicts were used to cut down the massive hewn pines, which was probably the most important raw material to this colony. They'd lash the logs together and then raft them down the river, eventually ending up here in Sarah Island. They'd be working 12 hours a day in freezing cold water and in irons under the scrutiny of the evil guards. Not surprisingly, their main objective was escape. And what kind of convicts were put here?
Two categories, really. A lot of convicts that were escapees from other penal stations that were put in this is like the Colditz of Australia.
Yeah.
And a lot of skilled men who were detailed down here to build ships.
So is this the kind of terrain that the convicts had to escape through?
If they were lucky, but in many places it's much more dense than this.
Would they have their chains on if they escaped?
No. Most of them would have lost their chains before they took off into the bush.
Yeah.
But some of the early escape attempts were done with either without boots or with boots that were so pathetic that they fell to pieces.
Wow.
So the convicts came in with bleeding feet.
Oh, I bet they did. Tell us about some exciting escapes.
My very favourite is the theft of the Cyprus, which is one of the supply vessels that was running around a mob of retransported convicts to Macquarie Harbour. And the convicts seized the vessel en route, and they put loyal convicts and some of the officers and crew on shore. And they sailed the Cyprus off to Japan, where they scuttled her, and then rowed ashore and pretended to be shipwrecked British mariners. They were sent all the way back to Britain as poor, starving shipwrecked sailors. And then one of them was walking down Pall Mall, and who should he meet coming the other direction but the ex-police constable from Hobart Town, who recognised his tattoos. So you get a whole series of escape attempts, and basically the convicts get better and better at it. So the early ones are like blundering probes. One of the early blundering attempts involved a group of 7 convicts who tried to take a direct route through the temperate rainforest and across the mountain ranges to Hobart. And very quickly they realised that they'd miscalculated, that things had gone wrong.
They decided among themselves, they had an axe with them that they'd stolen, decided they'd kill the weakest member of the party. Well, they killed the weakest member of the party and ate him in bits and pieces. They kept on killing the weakest. The last one to go was my ancestor William Coventry. They still had his leg bone when they made it through to civilisation, and they were promptly arrested and charged with his murder, but they were hanged in spite of the fact that his body was never found on their own evidence.
But the big point of the story is that it was subsequently used ad nauseum by the colonial administration to try and show A, what depraved men the convicts sent to Sarah Island were, and B, how hopeless it was to contemplate escape from here.
Some escapees fared better. William Buckley escaped to the bush and lived for 20 years with Aborigines. When he was eventually captured, he had forgotten how to speak English. He was pardoned and ended his days as a well-respected civil servant in Hobart. Although many convicts ended up in secondary settlements, the vast majority served their time and lived a better life than they could have hoped for in Britain. Around Oaklands, huge estates are still owned by the descendants of convicts.
Well, I'm Elizabeth Christensen, and my great-great-great-grandfather was Thomas Burberry, who was transported to Tasmania in 1832.
He was transported as a convict from Coventry in Warwickshire for his part in a riot in which a factory was destroyed.
The colonies in Australia were a prison in themselves. People weren't sent out here and put in behind brick walls. They were the Tasmania itself, the whole island was the prison, which means that convicts and free settlers mixed. Convicts did all the jobs that, you know, the underclasses do anywhere else, which meant that it was very important to people to be, the people who weren't convicts, to make sure that everybody knew they weren't convicts. They didn't want to be, you know, mistaken for one of them, which means that they were very conscious of their position in society. And being a convict really was something to be ashamed of and to hide if possible.
My name is Cecil Edmund Johnson, and I'm a grandson of William Johnson. He wasn't a convict, but the original Johnson, who was a convict, was Joseph Johnson. I spent a lot of time at my grandfather's place, and I wouldn't have known that this ex-convict even existed. I never heard his name mentioned once during my lifetime by the family. And the same more or less applied on the other side, but not the... They didn't discuss him either. It was considered a disgrace in those days.
But the hiding of convict roots for so long has meant that white Australia is still coming to terms with its own history and identity.
You know, they was all worked in as a team, the convicts. They're different today. Nobody cut one another's throats at them times for jobs or anything. They all seem to work in as a team.
And some of the convicts were some of the best tradesmen that ever came to Van Diemen's Land, which was Tasmania.
As the stigma attached to the convict era fades, Australians can reconcile their complex relationship with Britain.
We're a very egalitarian society. We have a different attitude to authority to what they have in Britain.
Our class system is not fixed like the British class system is fixed. I think that's what the difference is. We have a story from rags to riches and back in 3 generations.
Unfortunately, I think that the attitude towards the British people at the moment is not as kindly or friendly as it was at one stage.
I think the people who are descended from convicts have a sense of superiority or a feeling of superiority over later migrants because we were here first. And with reactions to Britain, we do talk about whinging Poms in Australia somewhat, and there is not really antagonism, but there's a little bit of a feeling of superiority over more recent British arrivals.
In the museum at Launceston in Tasmania, you can still see the flag of the Anti-Transportation League. In 1868, they put an end to transportation, and then a similar flag flew over the whole nation. 200 years on, the Australian flag still retains a permanent reminder of the country's convict past.
Personally, I don't understand why this bit is still there. They should have got rid of it years ago. Maybe now it's time for the scissors. Whee!
Carve your name upon my backbone. Stretch my skin upon a drum. Iron me up on Pinch Gut Island from now till kingdom come. I will eat your Norfolk dumpling like a juicy Spanish plum. Even dance the Newgate hornpipe if you'll only give me rum.